Hey guys, Cory back here. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite categories of baits, glide bait. One of the reasons it's one of my favorite categories of baits is unlike a lot of baits like spinner baits, blades, stuff like that, a lot of the differentials, the things you use to justify better ones from other ones, they all essentially kind of function the same way. There's little different tweaks and qualities people can do to make them do little unique things, but the gap of variation within those designs, there's not a lot of leeway. Like a double-bladed bucktail is double-bladed bucktail in most cases. Components can help. Still, the principle is basically the same. Crankbaits, a little bit more variation because you get to mess with the size of the bill mixed with the size of the bait and the weighting. A little bit different, but really when it comes down to just like having subtle nuances that really justify different models. Now, of course, some are lesser than others, I would argue, but it's amazing when you really break it down. A lot of gliders, they each have their own little nuances that really make them almost unique tools at times. Very recently, I was introduced to the work of Tim Woodyard, who is a pretty accomplished muskie angler in West Virginia, which is kind of the unofficial home of the glider. It has a long-standing tradition of people that have been hand carving gliders for years. To target the river muskies there. It's a long-standing tradition. It's like, almost like its own little like cult culture, which is pretty cool. But a lot of the gliders I've used, I mean, I've talked about so many. I like the Sean Chapin tail gunner. It's got a really nice sinking motion with a rocking motion down. That's a very unique trait. But you know, the Manta Hang 10, which is really glides out far. The Robinson UK glider does the same kind of motion where it skims the surface, doesn't really sink, hangs. The thing I really like about these is amongst all the squirrely tail gliders, especially that I've used, this has a really nice subtlety to it, but a consistent glide out, and it has a really nice hang to it. So a lot of times, yeah, I'll favor a glider that'll sink a little bit, but a lot of times what's really cool is being able to have that action kind of suspend itself. It's not the kind of glider you want to beat. You don't have to put a lot of energy behind it, which I think is like maybe the mistake some people might make. This one in particular has a really nice weighting to it, has a really nice hang. You can kind of tell too, like I'm not having to give it a lot of energy. You can really overdo it with these, but that's kind of the beauty of it. You don't want it to do a whole lot. Now I don't want to name names when I talk about gliders I don't like. Just kind of want to illustrate the positive properties of gliders I do like, and then maybe that'll help you kind of draw the same conclusions. But, you know, I've used different gliders throughout the years that some of them you tap and basically they just kind of like go 30 degrees to one side and then kind of stop. And it's like, okay, well, maybe at some point in my fishing career, like that will be the thing for the day, is a stick that goes down at a 30-degree angle and stops. Most of the time, though, you like to have a little bit more control over what you're doing. And that's what's really cool about these. Like, if I was wanting to fish down 6, 7, 8, 10 feet in some current, I probably wouldn't pick this one up. I'd probably go for more of like a Chapin glider. But the cool thing about these though is they really do have like a subtle action and a hang. You can tell these were designed to really, really capitalize on these shallow clear water rivers that Tim and his cohorts spend a lot of time on. They have some really big fish. And that's the cool thing, is they're very subtle. They have enough action, enough turn that they're animated, but they don't sink too fast. Kind of have that suspension and then fall. The tail kind of just twists a little bit as it goes down. You'd be amazed too, like so many things I talk about, you know, action isn't always action. Zero is a speed control. A lot of times these kind of things too, the subtlety and having control over the subtlety is a really, really positive attribute. It's like being able to fish through these things. Like I fished with him a couple weeks ago. I threw lots of stuff. He basically stole the show with these things under a pretty adverse condition. And I'm pretty convinced that that's why. Is his bait offered animation, but a little bit more subtlety. It wasn't as abrupt, it wasn't as violent. It seemed like it wasn't trying so hard to stimulate a response. It was just moving through the water. but it has enough of that swing to the side too, that it does glide out. It has that motion. It has that side to side walking the dog, but it does it in a much more casual way. Like, it's very leisurely. It's easy to work. And it does really well in current too. Used a lot of squirrely gliders. I'm pretty fond of this one, to be quite honest. And there you see, you give it a little bit more of a bump and it does that rocking and then it falls. That's cool. You notice if I just tap it really lightly, it just walks side to side. But when you want to give a little more of a bump, I'm not ripping it. Like sometimes with these baits like a Manta Hang 10, to get them to do what you want to do, you gotta, slap the shit out of them. This one, you watch what I'm doing? I ain't doing too much. I'm just giving it a little tap, give it a leash. Then I'm kind of letting it go out. It's kind of neat too. I can let it set. Usually doesn't turn itself if you give it slack. It stays at that angle, so the next time you pop it, it does turn back. And lets you really, really pick apart, like in this instance, we're fishing some shallow weed beds, stuff like that. Lets you really, really pick apart these pockets where you don't have to move through them too quickly. You can present something with some animation to them, but you don't have to keep moving it so much out of the strike zone to keep it doing what it's supposed to be doing. Let it sink down just a little bit. I really like that. Really like that a lot. That's a really, really, really useful tool. Something you might overlook because I said it's not as stated. It's not as accentuated as some of the gliders. Like people that see these things, they say, oh, look at the action on that thing. And it's like, well, yeah, I get that. Like I too, at times, like these really, really, really energized, abrupt gliders. But sometimes the action seems like it's almost a little bit too lugubrious. It's defeating the purpose. You want it to just be subtle. You want it to be able to turn side to side, but you don't want it to just be going nuts. You like something that's just a little bit more finesse. I'll tell you what, in that same vein, while we're at it, he makes another model that I was actually really impressed with too. It's more of a shad base. And so you see this design a lot in some other baits. Some are simply designed to walk, kind of meander back to the boat when you reel them. I like this because it does a little bit of both. Let me get us out of this weed bed. So like this is a totally different model. Notice the flat sides, the lack of the tail. So this one isn't going to glide as far out. But you notice how I just barely tap it and it just literally turns in on itself. It's not moving out too far. Can really overpower it. And then it just falls totally level. You can tell Tim has really realized the value of understatement. And that's pretty cool. Especially watch the little shimmy when it falls down. Like that's really cool. And it doesn't do it too fast. That's what's neat. Is there's a lot of baits that'll do that when you put weight in them. And they'll go down pretty fast and they'll do that shimmy. And that's cool. I like that at times. Like if I was fishing an area like this, though, it's relatively shallow with just a little slight current, might be a little bit too much. Might be sinking down way too quick. But this thing, look, I can sink it, let it pause. It might be dropping 4 inches a second, if that. And I can just really, 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 really pick apart any of these things. Any of these little pockets. Just because this was designed for rivers, don't think that it's just for rivers. This kind of style of bait, and we'll do some of that more in the future. We'll show you how to utilize something like this over open water. Because especially when fish are sitting suspended and they're not responding to trolling or rubber, look at that, just the way it just slowly dies. And I'm not big on like, well, you have to be totally natural, quote unquote, but I mean, That's without I've got no tension on it, and you just watch that thing slowly shimmer down. That's a really fine weighting job. Like that's cool. Just let it fall. That's the little details you want to pay attention to, especially with gliders. Because too many times what I see people do is they'll pick up a glider and they just same motion. Well, they'll work every glider the same way they work every glider. And look, this is the way a lot of guys will work gliders. Up, down, up, down. Oh, nah, I don't like it. I don't like it. Well, that's because these all respond to different things a little bit differently. Like this one, I'm just barely pulling it side to side. Tap, tap, tap. That's a really, really neat little tool. And that's honestly something I didn't really have in my box until I found his. The other neat thing though too is watch when you just straight reel it. Same physics that let it tap side to side. You just straight reel it, look at this. It just meanders. And that's pretty neat too. Put some speed on it, it kind of kicks. You can kill it. So that's literally the kind of bait you can use it. Tap, 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 get it started. Let it sink down a little bit. A lot of times, you know, let's say I have a fish following behind it. Let's say just that little bitty subtle turn tail, the little wobble on the fall, get someone's attention, but I want to trigger them. I can guarantee you being able to do that mid-retrieve, go from something really subtle to get the attention, and then just all of a sudden make it dart away with little side-to-side kicks. That's a neat little device right there. But like I said, that's the cool thing about gliders is, you know, explore them. Like try different shapes, and you'll get to where you have like a knack and an eye for. You'll be able to look at one and be like, oh, I bet that does this. Oh, I bet this one does that. Oh, I bet if I try this with this shape, like there's a lot of there's a lot of flat-sided gliders. One of the cool things about this though is it does have a flat side, but you notice how it's all kind of rounded into that edge? That gives it a little bit more of an organic feel to its motion, even though it turns tight like a flat-sided glider. Like you notice the other one when I was throwing it, it won't do that as much. It has a little bit more of a meander, but it's not going to have that kick side to side like that. But when it darts, it turns a little bit, does not quite as tight. It'll glide out a little bit more. It'll glide out this way a little bit more. You can tell it's rounded. It's got some angles on it, but they're mostly at the back. But a bait like this, especially when it's got the flat sides, but it's a little bit more rounded on all the corners or on the edges, it's going to turn tight, but it's also going to let you have kind of the luxury of like some organic variation to it. That's what's neat about gliders, is because there's no external device, there's no lip, there's no blade, there's nothing really mechanical to them. They really are kind of like the thinking man's bait, I guess, in a way, when it comes to presentation, because they're so open to interpretation. Not just in the fact of like when you fish a crankbait, you fish a spinnerbait, a lot of the interpretation of the presentation comes from, well, where am I going to use this? What situation am I going to use this? The neat thing about gliders is so often the interpretation, you can change it within the single retrieve. Like I just said, like you have so much control and articulation over these things because there's really nothing getting in the way of them. You're providing every ounce of animation to this. Every movement is dependent upon what you're doing, and not just what you're doing, but how you're doing it. So, that being said, Tim Woodward is a craftsman who makes some really, really, really cool, unique gliders. Probably more unique than most of them that I've seen. It does take a little bit of like a learning curve if you're not used to really exploring things as far as the way these different baits respond, the different taps, different lengths of the stroke of the rod, giving them slack. But I'm telling you, the more you explore baits like this and see what they have to offer, not only will you find more tools like this and appreciate them in their proper time, but you'll probably learn how to do a few more tricks with the other baits you've got in your box as well that you didn't know you could do before. I'll tell you what, that's two of my favorite gliders that I've discovered recently. But that's going to be an ongoing saga. We're going to talk a lot more about the gliders and muskie fishing. It's kind of one of those things that's almost endemic to muskie fishing. You don't really see a lot of it in bass fishing or pike fishing. You see a little bit of it in pike fishing overseas, but I'm pretty convinced that a lot of that came from them emulating us as much as we emulate them in some things. But stay tuned with that. We're going to be talking about some few other baits, some from Tim, some not from Tim, and talk about the differences and the justifications. Not that necessarily ones are better than the others, but they offer unique strengths and unique traits that will dictate when you put this one down, you pick that one up, when you try different things. But for now, get back to fishing. My name's Cory, and hope you guys enjoy it. Talk to you later. Hey guys, Cory Allen with In the Spread. We've been talking about different bait types today. Trying to show you like not only how to work the baits, some different idiosyncrasies of the baits, but also like the different types of situations you might find yourself wanting to rely on these baits a little bit more. We covered gliders a little bit earlier, but right now I'm going to talk about something I consider it a specialty tool, but it's one of those things that like you can make or break your day. It's twitch baits. Now twitch baits is kind of a broad term because you can twitch a lot of baits. Twitch baits for the most part are considered kind of minnow-bodied, shallow diving baits. Some suspend, some dive deeper, some swing out more. For the most part, this is about as quintessential as a twitch bait gets. And that is a Crane, really famous model, twitch baits, custom painted and weighted by Tim Woodyard. I got to see these in action for the first time. I'm actually a way bigger fan of the Crane bait after he got a hold of them and did a few little slight tweaks to them. Not only the paint job's good, but he took a really good design, added a little bit more weight to it, some thicker epoxy, and they can take a lot more abuse, so I can rip them. I know a lot of the Cranes I used before I couldn't rip as well. They'd want to roll out, they'd want to pop out a little bit. They were kind of difficult to tune. It's a great bait, especially if you're just popping it. But if you put any kind of real exertion on it, they seem to put a little bit of a fit up. So he just took it, put a fresh paint job on it, made them run a little bit better. But the cool thing about these baits is when you want to trigger strikes from fish sitting in relatively shallow water, they are dope. They've got that really tight, erratic biting action, like you feel it thump down the rod. And then most of these baits, especially twitch baits that are made by like craftsmen, like the Crane baits, made from really high buoyancy wood with epoxy on them, so they have that really fast recoil on the float. They're relatively light. And because they're light, not just in weight, but just like the heft of the bait itself, they dart out. They really, really respond to the square bill they put on these things. In a situation like this, we watched these baits save our butts. A couple weeks ago, Tim got a 51 with me on one of these. And as soon as I saw it run in the water, I was like, yeah, it's about as good as we can do right now for a presentation. But here we are back in relatively shallow water, darker water. You don't want to go too deep. And especially if you get down a little bit too deep, you're going to be picking weeds off your bait the whole time. But instead of just having a bait that we can zip past, like a bucktail spinner bait, or something that's going to be a little bit maybe too subtle to trigger a strike, an impulse, like a glide bait, it kind of limits your options after that. But this twitch bait category, especially something like this, it's small, erratic, you can pump it down, you can hit it hard, it's going to spring right back. But the best thing is it's just going to skim right over these shallow weeds. Really, really, really effective little tool. And the cool thing is too, yeah, you can twitch them. And sometimes it's really good to take maybe 1 out of every 5 casts. Normally when I'm fishing, I'll take 1 out of every 5 casts I'm making with a presentation and do something with it just totally the opposite of what I've been doing. So I've been twitching the crap out of it. But they also do this really cool little tight, almost a wake bait, but subsurface wiggle. So you can just kind of twitch it at the boat, but just doing that slow pivot side to side like that. Sometimes that's what's going to trigger the fish to at least follow it and then kill it. Sometimes though, when they're sitting inactive and neutral, some of these shallow flats like this, it's amazing. You'll twitch, you'll burn, you'll do all these other things. But sometimes if they just have something like that just hovering over their head really slow, you'd be amazed how violent the strikes can be. I'll tell you what, guys, now we're out here in a little bit more light. Kind of get to show you the action a little bit better on camera. Because these really are a specialty tool. Like, I won't lie, this is not the kind of bait I'm going to find myself reaching for a lot of times if I'm fishing over deep water. I mean, sometimes throwing these shallow baits over suspended fish can be a really surprise tactic. But most of the time, if I'm wanting to get down, I'm not going to pick this bait. But when it shines, it really shines. Now, especially if you're fishing in rivers, you're trying to cast into pockets of current. Glide baits work, but don't count these out. Because even when I'm just doing this, I'm getting maximum action. And I'm not moving it forward very much at all. Like, the shorter the violent the tap you make, like, it'll shake its head 2 or 3 times. You can feel it. But it's only maybe moving forward about half its body length, if that. So it kind of stays in the same zone. But you still get that erratic response without covering a whole lot of water. It's a really efficient way to do it. But then you come to situations like this where you're fishing relatively expansive, shallow water. And especially if you know there's fish here, like we know there's some fish here. Throwing spinner baits, nothing's wanted to follow that. Throwing glide baits. When I'm just doing this, I'm not looking for a fish to follow. This is almost like an aggressive finesse fishing in that I'm just going maybe 6 inches forward every time I tap it, but I'm giving it a violent jerk, letting it sit. So every 6 inches I move forward, I'm basically covering it, saying like, okay, is there an active fish here I can trigger? Okay, no. Is there an active fish here I can trigger? No. Is there an active fish here? I'm not expecting those fish to follow that bait when I'm doing this. I'm expecting them to just instinct strike it just out of the sheer erratic notion of it and the fact that it's diving just deep enough that it's getting right into the face of these fish in 3 to 5 feet of water. Not picking up weeds, kind of skimming over them, but it's got that erratic kick, and then the fact that it's so buoyant, it just springs right back up. So it's doing an erratic kick out, and then it basically evades going up. Sometimes give it a little bit longer pull. This is an incredibly effective tactic. I know a lot of guys that use this kind of presentation. They're fishing shallow weeds. Works really well like that. You can just see too. That's about as janky as they come. I'll tell you what, for a little bitty light bait, they cast like the dickens too. So you can cover a lot of water. Really hoping we can just have a fish popping on film right now. That'd be nice. You can see that too when I take that through the water and I'm like sending out those shock waves and those tremors. Every once in a while you'll see a little shad or something like scurry out of the way. Ah, got it fouled a little bit. Top ends. The other cool thing about these baits too, and we'll show you that in a little bit, like a lot of the baits will come with stock hooks as such. And I'm not knocking the hooks. I mean, these hooks landed a 51 incher. It's not the quality of the hooks that I'm worried about. They're fine. And in fact, a lot of ways, it's cool to have these little, like, tinier hooks, a little bit, they're thinner so they penetrate a little bit better. And they're stout. What we'll do in a little bit here is I'll show you what you can do to like weight these baits just by putting different hooks on them. So like if you want to get them to hang just a little bit more, sometimes it'll actually make them swing out a little bit more. You put a little bit slightly heavier hooks on these really, really buoyant baits. Even though they're buoyant, it's wood, it's really sensitive to weight. So you can take that and just put a different size hook on, maybe like 2 sizes up. And it adds just enough weight that'll make the bait hang a little bit more. Obviously not ideal if we're trying to fish over super shallow water. You want to do this hit, rise, hit, rise, hit, rise, hit, rise thing. But if you're wanting it to hang just a little bit more and take your time, a good way to do that is to change out the hooks, put a little bit bigger hooks on it. Like I said, not so much because you're concerned about being able to land the fish on them, but it's just a way to integrate weighting into a bait by just changing out something you need on it anyway, which is a hook. And especially these little baits like this, these little twitch baits like these cranes, you can really fine tune them with just changing out the hook sizes. You can get to where you can make them do different things. Like you can put big hooks on the back, leave a small one on the front, and they'll hang those up like that. It's really interesting what you can do. Just play around with it. So just a few moments ago I was talking about, you know, you can do some minor adjustments. One of the cool things you can do with these little light jerk baits like this, or twitch baits, is add a little weight, changing out the hooks. Not so much because you're worried about the hook's integrity, but if you want it to get just a little bit deeper, have a little bit more heft, maybe a little bit more hang, it's a really easy thing to do without really having to do too much to the bait as far as like compromising the integrity of the body. You don't have to screw anything in, just add new hooks to the front. So I put, he's about 2 sizes larger. And I think I mentioned, you know, get the rise head up. But you can tell too, probably more if you were actually fishing it. It's got a little bit more of a roll, a little bit more of a hang to it. I can pump it a little bit harder. It still rises just fine. It's not quite as straight back up, straight back up. Kind of takes a moment, lifts the head and then starts to rise. See that? See, before it would almost spring all the way back. I put some heavier hooks on it, and now what it does is I jerk it down, jerk it down, jerk it down. Still not getting very deep. Don't want it to get very deep. But the cool thing is it's got a little bit more of a pause before it starts to rise, and you'll see that head turn up, and then it starts to come up head first to the surface. And a little thing like that just lets you kind of keep it down a little bit more. You can see that, like, it takes a moment. It takes a moment just to turn direction. Get it down. Just even that little momentary hesitation to tilt and then come up make a big difference sometimes. Usually I don't do it to all the baits. I'll keep like different hooks on different ones. Keep some of the original light ones, change them out. I'll probably put even bigger hooks on another one just to see how it goes. Another thing we'll do here, so I'll show you a cool little trick you can do with these as well. Probably haven't seen before, but I can guarantee you it's going to work. Doesn't really compromise the action too much. These things are so erratic as is. But little heads up, we're going to put a little blade on the back. And that's kind of a cool little thing to do on the back of these baits, because when I'm talking about a blade, I mean like a tiny blade, little bitty blade. Something you'd find on an Alabama rig. Nothing to really inhibit the action, but just when you do that erratic pull, it's just going to give it a little bit of a flash behind it. And you know, devil's in the details, as they say. But the biggest thing is, you do stuff like that, at the very least, it doesn't hurt. But I've seen a lot of times where even a little minor adjustment, like what we just did, or adding a blade to the back with the 3-way swivel, make a whole lot of difference. But for now, this is Cory Allen and the spread. Hope you guys enjoyed that little snippet, and hopefully I'll be back to you really soon with a fish in the net. See you guys. Hey guys, Cory Allen, I'm back again. We just talked about twitch baits. Like I said, that's kind of a little bit of an ambiguous category because you can twitch a lot of baits, a lot of crankbaits, a lot of stuff like that. I wouldn't really call this a twitch bait, but it's a really shallow diving square bill crankbait made by Acme Lures out of Kentucky. And it's like a crankbait. Like I'm fixing to troll this, but one of the cool things is a bait like this, it's got a lot of the same tendencies as the twitch bait we showed you earlier, the crane, but it's just got a little bit more of a belly roll to it. But it still has that same kind of dive out dart. See if you can see that. It's kind of the same principle. Now because it's not as long, it's not as flat bodied, you're not going to get that same kick out, but you are going to get more of a dart out. If that makes any sense. So it's not going to be such this, you know, trimmer down the rod tip. But with this one, you twitch it, and you're more just trying to make the head shake side to side. Like with that crane earlier, something like that, usually you give it a good rip, you'll feel 2 or 3 head shakes out of it. With this one, I'm less concerned about that, and I'm more concerned about tapping it to get that darting action. You can see it's a lot of the same physics. It rises about the same rate, dives about the same depth, but instead of just going in a straight line and kind of tracking out and then wiggle, 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 shaking his head, this one janks out a little bit more, while also staying in that top layer of the water column. We're not having to worry about getting into weeds, having to pick it up all the time. But what's kind of cool, you twitch this bait and you can kind of tell just every time you give it a little bit of a burst of energy, you'll see it like move out one way side to side. When you straight crank it, you'll see even though it tracks pretty well, it even has a little bit of a wander to it then. It's hard to notice sometimes. You put some speed on it, you'll see it kind of track out from center. You see a crankbait do that on a straight crank, it's a good candidate for this kind of twitching. So you can see there, like if I was hitting this with the crane, I'd be getting 2 or 3 of those shakes out of it. This one I almost don't want it to do the shakes. I just want it to kind of jank out, hit, 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 hit. Which, I mean, you know, to the untrained eye seems like it's a very, very almost analogous presentation, but you'd be amazed sometimes. Just a little shift like that. More the deviation than anything. It's got a little bit of that bump action. But it swings out a little bit more than the crane. It's got less of a caboose to deal with. So, ooh. Hit something. Probably the coolest thing about this style of bait too is, I mean, like I talked about the glide baits being like some of the most interpretive. Like you can do so many things with a glide bait because the entire action of the bait is depending on what you do with that rod tip. It can't do anything without that. If you just pull it in a straight line, it's just usually either gonna kind of meander a little bit, or it'll do that side to side thing we showed you with the one shad bodied bait by Tim Woodyard. But with these, they've got a little bit more of a construct to them to give them like an inherent action under force, but you can get kind of crazy with it. Like one of the worst things to do with a style of bait like this is to just hit it the same way every time, like get into a rhythm. You want to kind of like feel it out a little bit. They really kind of let you have your own way with it. When you figure eight too, especially with a bait like this, don't necessarily just go into a circle and a turn. Continue what you've been doing. Sometimes 2 or 3 circles at the boat. But that's a pretty nice little darting action. Like I said, Acme crankbaits out of Kentucky, hand painted, custom painted, and weighted by Tim Woodyard. Gives them a little bit more of a heft to their step, a little bit more of a swing. Little things like that can make a big difference. But I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation of another twitch bait, a crankbait that I'm using like a twitch bait. And I hope you guys are able to see like little creative applications and stuff like that after what I showed you with this one, because I can promise you, this is a great one, but there's other ones out there too. This is Cory Allen. You guys have a good day. I managed to get a little one here right at last light. Came up, just tapping the Elk River Lures sucker glider. Kind of ran at the boat, kind of walking it back and forth. I watched her come up and just basically pound the crap out of it. Not working it too fast, just kind of letting it do its thing. I'll tell you what, we're going to get her back. She's had a very stressful day. Oh. Got her. Well, you can feel that cool water just putting your hand down. You good? All right. Here she goes. Very cool. Gliders work.